delighted to introduce Sayeed, who I've been working actually with for now about 5 years. But Sayeed has a wealth of experience across the academic sphere and also many other areas. But I have asked you today to share your thoughts on the academic space. So without further ado, Sayeed, would you like to take it away?
Thank you, Claire. So how many of you would consider yourself from academia? Okay, a few. So I'll begin by saying I don't presume to speak for all of academia, even within the United States, but I do have the benefit of starting the first open source programs off at the U.S. University when I was at Johns Hopkins. And now that I'm at Carnegie Mellon, I started an article there, which is the second wave, if you will, of the University Hospital movement, which is something I'll talk about more. So in terms of academia, I think a lot of what you heard this morning makes sense about open source within the university context as well. And we are learning a lot from hospitals that have been in existence in the private sector and even some in the government sector. But academia is also very different. There are some very unique aspects of its mission, of the roles of faculty, students, and of the way things work. And this diagram that I'm showing you here shows three of the research outputs that we often focus on, from left to right, of articles, books, to data, to software. And they are not the only research outputs. So Claire talked about open source hardware, for example. There are other types of things that might happen. But in the United States, we've had a set of so-called public access memos that basically move from left to right in this diagram. So providing more access to the outputs of universities, starting with articles, then to data, and then to software. And one of the ways in which we have engaged the university faculty and the students around open source is asking them this question of, do you care about research? If I go and ask people, do you care about open source software, I'll get lots of different answers. But I can't imagine anyone in the university saying, I don't care about research. So by casting open source software as a research output, that is a very important role in activating the entire university and saying, yes, we care about research, we want to manage it properly, we want to manage the risks, we want to have impact on it, and so on. I will sometimes hear, well, I care about research and I produce software, but why should I care about open source? And we heard this morning how much of the software we use is built on open source or is released as open source software. And if you think that there's a set of lines going off to the right in this diagram, one thing an OSPO is doing is helping our university to think about the impact from all that open source software. So when I arrived at Carnegie Mellon, one of the first conversations I had was with the technology transfer office. I met the director. And I will confess, there was a bit of a tense moment at the beginning where he said, are you going to tell everyone to produce all their research as open source? And I said, I think you and I both know we don't tell the faculty what to do in a comprehensive way about anything. But in cases where people are already producing open source software or wish to produce open source software, our office is here to help. And where we landed is he said, my office is here to help people commercialize their IP. But if there are other ways in which people wish to have impact, including other forms of commercialization around software or building community or other sustainability models, let's work together. And that's really important. So we're not saying tech transfer is no longer valid. Clearly it is. It's just as important. But the OSPO and open source is another way, an alternate way of having that kind of impact, that kind of commercialization, that kind of dissemination. So the OSPO at Carnegie Mellon is relatively new. It started in July of 2022, but we feel like we've already done quite a bit. And mainly by acting as a center of competency and a community convener. So again, in a university setting or a research institution setting, it's really important. If you're going to claim you're a center of excellence, you better really be a center of excellence. We have such things at Carnegie Mellon that are large grant funded, led by researchers who lead their fields and so on. Maybe it's just a sense of humility or modesty. We just didn't feel like it made sense to say we are a center of excellence. But what we do know is how open source works, even outside of the university context, and we can help people learn best practices, nudge them in those directions, and then we can help build a sense of community. We heard about culture already in the first session, and I would say one of the really important roles of an OSPO is to help build that culture within the university. So there's already a lot of people interested in open source, but not necessarily understanding how to work with each other, how to do things in a so-called open source way. We are not alone in doing this. I mentioned that I used to be at Johns Hopkins and started an hospital there, and now I'm at Carnegie Mellon. Thanks to Claire and some other very capable people, we have a new network called Curious, the Community for University and Research Institution Hospitals. I didn't come up with that name, although I think it's very clever. So this is initially started by the Sloan Foundation, but is now evolving into having hospitals who are not funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation as well. And we have become a collective, a sense of a community in our own way, and we're sharing best practices, we're learning from each other. I'll give you a couple of examples. So recently we produced a guide for how to start an OSPA in a university or a research institution. And we also produced a guide for licenses for open source software. So I will tell you, and I don't think this is a secret, but I've already encountered multiple projects at Johns Hopkins, at Carnegie Mellon, and at Johns Hopkins, where people have said, we have open source software. And I will say, what license do you have? And they'll say, license? What do you mean license? So we are at that stage in some cases, and now that we have multiple institutions from which we can look to, I can not only say this is the advice from our tech transfer office, this is the advice from our hospital, this is the advice from a network of institutions. 22 institutions, 52 individuals, I believe is what Claire said. 4 of them are based in Europe. This is a screenshot of just only a subset of them. I managed to get Carnegie Mellon, Bureau, and Trinity on this slide. But there's a whole other set. I'd encourage you to go to curious.org to find out more. So just a few examples of some of the things we're doing within the OSPA. Not surprisingly, a lot of it is focused around the faculty and the students. We do support staff who are also producing open source software, of course. But some of the things we try to do is help them understand the industry best practices, and in essence say, that's the way it's done in industry. You don't have to do it that way, but if you want to work with industry, maybe you might want to start doing things in that way. We've heard of stories where industry tries to work with universities on open source. It takes months for them to make that connection and engagement. I love your talk and the point about trust. It's hard to trust something if you can't even interpret what it is, how it works, who's working on the documentation. I mentioned the licensing best practices, the sustainability, including market discovery. Our OSPA has a really fantastic community manager named Tom Hughes, who has a background that's very conducive to basically helping people understand who might be interested in your software beyond your original research team. We support submission of proposals to both federal and state and private funding sources who are increasingly asking about information about the software we're producing, and in some cases requiring that it be open source. So we have standard templates to do that, but also customized types of services that support our faculty when they submit those proposals. I'd encourage you to go to Stephen Wally's talk later today about the really amazing work he's doing with the Summer of Code course that is essentially taking open source software as a laboratory to help students understand building software at scale. So one of the things about Carnegie Mellon is the #1 ranked computer science department in the US. We like to brag about that. But they don't get a lot of real world experience. They actually come to industry and don't really know how professional software developers work together, how you do things at scale. So Stephen's presentation can give you some great insights about that. And as you might imagine, we have fellowship programs, and we support hackathons, and a lot of the student clubs. And students, bless them, they're incredibly bright, energetic, they're early in their careers. So there are a lot of things they can learn, but even basic types of things, such as we can no longer get into our GitHub repo because the senior who did this last year's graduated. Helping manage that transition is one of the things we're doing. We're also trying to think about ways in which we can scale the services that we offer. Daniel from Peturgia is here, so you can hear more about this with him. Peturgia, very simply, is a dashboard analytics framework that allows you to assess the health of your open source project in terms of contributors, time to address commits, and so on. Another tool called SCARF, which is a bit further downstream. Who is using your software? In what ways? Are they looking at your documentation? Are they looking at your code? So these are services that we offer broadly. And as you might imagine, groups like Tech Transfer, groups like our research, our Vice President for Research Office, they're interested in those questions. We're producing all this open source software. How is it being used? What kind of impact is it having? So one important aspect of this conversation I want to bring is this concept of moving from project to product. So this is a slide that Stephen shared with me in some of the documents he's been putting together. So we have a lot of faculty members who typically start these projects with some kind of grant, and in essence get to a certain point where they say, hey, we'd like this to be used widely, or we'd like to take you through some commercialization process or some revenue process, or we'd like to engage with other universities and so on. And there's a fundamental phase change, quite frankly, that has to happen when something moves from that project to a product. And it's literally, in some cases, as much as you're making all your decisions on this whiteboard. That's not going to work if you want to have contributors from outside of Carnegie Mellon. Or you need to pick a license, which is not only an expression of the legal aspects of it, but what you think community norms might be. These are all sorts of questions that are not really front and center in faculty's mind. And I will tell you one thing, I've been a principal investigator of grants. I don't typically want someone at the beginning of that process to ask me these questions. I get that. There's a lot that has to happen when one of these grants is spinning up. But one point we've been making to them is there are downstream consequences to the choices you make. And if you don't make a choice, that is a choice. License is a good example. So that conversation has been very helpful in them saying, okay, plant those seeds in my mind, and let me think about those, and if I get to this point where I have to make this kind of phase change, then it's good that I think about that up front. We're having to do a lot of retrospective work right now, because we're still in early days, and many projects didn't have this happen. But I'd like to believe that eventually we can get to the point where even when someone is just starting out with a grant, or even better, when they're writing a proposal, they at least think about these issues so that we can address them more structurally, systematically, and strategically. So a few examples that I want to share coming out of Carnegie Mellon, something called Penrose. This comes out of our computer science department. It's a very compelling application that allows you to draw beautiful diagrams. It started off by, for math applications, but as you can see, the beauty of open source, some chemist came along and said, hey, why can't I use this to draw chemicals and molecules? And it's being used in lots of different kinds of contexts. The Open Energy Outlook has an open source platform called Tomoa. This is an optimization model that looks at the impact of different policies for energy. So if we have this type of policy, then what does that mean in terms of how much carbon gets produced, how much solar gets produced, and so on. And then Spiral, which is something that comes out of our engineering school. It's a signal processing type of project, but it's used to analyze storage systems. So really at every aspect of the stack, the IT stack, we're seeing open source, we're seeing these projects say we want to have a more robust type of community development effort, and we're making this phase change happen with the help. They're making this phase change happen with the help of the OSPO. So I realize I can't do a presentation about open source these days without talking about AI. I will also note I am a board member of the Open Source Initiative, though I'm not speaking in that capacity right now. But I was part of the process that we had over the last 2 years to come up with the open source AI definition. If you're not familiar with that, I would encourage you to take a look at it. I will say something that I have said publicly, that I believe it's really important to have a definition. I believe that OSI is an organization that allows us to have a lot of feedback from both the legal and developer communities. And that since this term is being used, even in documents such as the EU AI Act, we need to have some kind of definition for it. But I've also said that one thing that's really important is to assess this definition from an engineering perspective. Right? So AI is not software. It's at least an order of magnitude more complex. It has components that go beyond data or computer or software. The algorithms are really a key part of AI. So what we've said about the open source AI definition is that it is stable, but it is not permanent. So there's room for it to evolve, and I suspect it will. In that context, we are leading something out of Carnegie Mellon called the Open Forum for AI, or OFAI. And this is an attempt to basically make AI more human-centered. And by that, I mean we are currently in a very reactive mode. New models get released, and we all go use them. We try to figure out how they work and see what their capabilities are. maybe we can assess how safe they are, how transparent they are, and so on. We'd like to move to a more proactive approach, whereby engaging with people earlier and often in the process and giving them a sense of agency and choices about AI, we can come up with better design principles and specifications and requirements and design the models in that way. That's a tall order. I understand that, but I think it's a very important one. And what I'll say is that universities, at least in the US, where AI began, quite frankly, have not had much of a voice yet in the way that the AI trajectory is moving. And I think if you think about the internet and the web and the way they were developed, it was this sort of triple helix of university, industry, and government. And that balance has gotten out of balance, quite frankly, with AI. So a big part of what we're trying to do with OFAI is recalibrate that by focusing on openness in AI. Right? So again, you can't say open AI for obvious reasons. I'm not necessarily saying it's open source AI. I think that's an important foundation. But what does openness in AI mean from a research perspective, all the way to the implementation of that within AI systems and the deployment and assessment? And just about that journey of moving from project to product, I think the same thing can happen with AI, and that open source and OSPO is playing a key role in that process. So I do think we may have a few minutes for questions. I just will go the acknowledgements. And thank you for your attention.
Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
So I'm from the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. So that rebalancing, obviously, you know, it's swung very much towards industry at the moment, and that interaction between academia and government, I think, is going to be a very strategic move going into the future. Now, one of the difficulties we have is obviously the ownership of IP when it comes to national security. That relationship has to change between universities. So how do you going to do that, to sort of change that power balance?
I won't do it alone. It will take a concerted effort to do that. But I will note, and I'll come back to open source as a foundation. I'll talk more about this in the panel in the afternoon, but one of the reasons faculty have been so drawn to the OSPO and open source is not as visionary or strategic as research. It is, do I have to talk to the contracts office? You're telling me I don't have to talk to the contracts office? Sure, sign me up. It really is a more seamless way to work across institutions, and in many ways, I don't believe open source licenses were created to manage risk, but they are in some sense an expression of risk, or how risk may be managed. There are a lot of people in universities who care about risk and managing risks. So I think, you know, to echoing Omar's points, right? He works, you know, probably in a very conservative risk-averse organization. It's making some structural changes because it's embracing open source. And I think the same things will happen in the university sector in the US. Faculty are not risk-averse, right? Many faculty are risk-preferring, if you want to think of it that way. So how do we find a way to take that culture, which is also part of universities, and translate that into these kinds of conversations?
Thank you both. And I think we've got another one here from Paul, maybe the last one.
Hi. The challenge of the accelerated timescales, everything happening so fast, but the funding timescales staying the same and the whole lot, is just like, the one thing I haven't figured out, my question is, are curious helping people with this. So for people outside academia, which I currently am, and a lot of people in the room are, how do we engage with things like this to get to bring some of the balance back, to bring some of the stuff to work that's been done out and get it used, and you know, how do we engage?
Right.
Great to know.
Yeah. So I'll say a couple of things in response to that. One is, again, it comes back to most of the three-letter words for contracts, MOUs, DUAs, whatever, reflect grants. That's actually the way most universities work with each other, right, is through grants. That is a very slow process. So I've, again, argued open source is another way of having a, quote, contract, whatever you want to call it, dating, whatever form makes sense. It's a much more seamless, much more frictionless kind of way of doing that. The second thing I'll say is the open forum for AI, you you can see two of the organizations listed here, Video Network and Noble Ridge Foundation, are actually VC-backed groups. Right? And one of the not so subtle goals I have through OFAI is influencing where the VC community starts funding. And at least in the United States, the amount of private equity right now rivals large governments. So there is an opportunity, quite frankly, even on the funding side, to move this conversation. And I can tell you that one of the most interesting aspects of OFAI is I am new to the VC world. Trying to map the university to that world has been interesting. But I think we need to do more of that. I think we need to find ways for universities to engage with a diversity of funders who have different time scales, different ways of working.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has a final question. Yeah, Alika?
Sorry.
So one of the challenges that I see in institutions that there are no permanent leaders, and some leaders are very keen in open source and they give you a lot of resources that you need, and when they leave there's a new leader who comes back and you have to build your case again for why it's important. Can you tell us how to navigate these kind of ups and downs in institutions?
Yeah, many points of contact, right? So you're correct, university leaders and faculty and certain students lead. But the more people we have who have heard the story, have bought the story, have embraced the vision and so on, the more it permeates throughout the system, right? So imagine the provost at Carnegie Mellon is incredibly supportive of all of this. Let's say he leaves. The next provost comes in, talks to the faculty and students and hears, hey, we have this open source, we have OSPO, we really care about this. Open source AI is really important for us. I'd like to believe any new leader coming in, the first thing they do is take the pulse of the institution. So the more we can spread this and say, look at all the open source projects at Carnegie Mellon, look at all the faculty, all the students, all the way we've translated this from back, that message will persist over time.
Well, thank you. And I will say, as Sayeed mentioned, he is in a panel later in the day. So